Gentlemen, as seen in that video, it is a good reminder that today COVID-19 has splintered the cracks in our systems and turned them into canyons. And with global unemployment expected to stand at 205 million people by 2022, compounded by the fact that social protection benefits fail to reach more than half of the population, the world has never been less prepared to handle future shocks. And whether these shocks be related to climate change, to future pandemics and health crises, or in the form of another global financial crash, what we do know is that they are coming. Reforms on basic incomes, on universal social protection, including, of course, universal health care and better labor conditions, including for the care and the growing green economy, all of these we know are an urgent necessity to get the world back on track and to secure a just transition as we move towards net zero. And so contextually, ahead of the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, of the G20 and G7 summits of COP15, COP26, and the Financing for Development Forum, of course, and the 15th session of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD 15, we know that this high-level meeting will highlight concrete actions and concrete recommendations to foster a job-rich, human-centered recovery, to expand social protection, and to invest in a just transition that is inclusive and sustainable to economies, ensuring that these can all bring an end to poverty for all. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, today we're going to kick off with some welcoming remarks and a scene setter. We're going to follow this by a panel discussion on macroeconomic policies to finance green jobs and social protection. We're then going to make our way to a high-level panel on national and regional commitments. This, of course, to create decent jobs, to expand social protection, and to support a just transition. We're going to round it off with a third panel that is going to focus on mobilizing public and private investment for an inclusive and green recovery before we land on our closing remarks. Of course, we are coming to you live on UN Web TV as well, so a big welcome to those who are watching us on their screens. And we are amplifying the conversation on social media. We're using the hashtags, #FinForDev, #UNGA, and the third hashtag is decent work. And we're using one more to make it 4, and that is #social protection. As always, we're trying to have an inclusive conversation, and so we are interpreting across all 6 of the UN official languages. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we know that Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, really spoke to his policy brief. But what I would like to do now is to introduce Mr. Antonio Guterres. We know that he was recently appointed as the Secretary General of the United Nations. We know that last week he launched the report entitled Our Common Agenda. This, of course, was designed to steer the world towards a robust recovery, including what that looks like in a post-2030 era. The report, when we engage with it, calls for a new social contract. It calls on us to rebuild trust and to embrace a comprehensive vision of human rights. And of course, this includes a new era of universal social protection, of health coverage, of education, of skills, of decent work and housing, with women and girls placed firmly at the center. And so with that, I'd like to say, Mr. Secretary General, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, almost 2 years into the COVID-19 crisis, a huge divergence in the recovery is undermining global trust and solidarity. The pandemic has not only confirmed, but deepened existing inequalities. In developed countries, access to vaccines has allowed economies to reopen, while stimulus payments and investments herald projected growth of 5 or 6% this year. In sub-Saharan Africa, that figure is just about 2.5%. A recent report by UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, forecast that the cumulative cost of delayed vaccination alone will amount to $2.3 trillion by 2025, with developing countries bearing the brunt. This could lead not only to a lost decade for development, but to a lost generation of poorly educated, unemployed, disaffected young people. Across the developing world, the pandemic has caused lasting damage, while debt burdens prevent governments from investing in recovery. Advanced economies are investing nearly 28% of their gross domestic product into economic recovery. For middle and low-income countries, that number is between 2 and 6.5%, a tiny proportion of much smaller amounts. For middle and low-income countries, of these same developing countries are facing the worst ravages of the climate crisis, which they did nothing to create. And global solidarity so far has been inadequate. This uneven, unfair recovery is eroding trust between the developed and the developing world, trust that is essential to global cooperation in other areas. Today's meeting is an opportunity to change course and to build a recovery that benefits all. The pandemic is set to increase the number of extremely poor people by up to 224 million around the world. More than 3/4 of these new poor are in middle-income countries. And many developing countries face crippling debt service costs while their domestic budgets are stretched and their ability to raise taxes is reduced. These countries urgently need a helping hand. But many, particularly vulnerable middle-income countries, do not qualify for aid and debt relief under current rules. I welcome the recent issuance of $650 billion in special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund. But obviously they are distributed by quotas, largely to the countries that they need them least. And it is important that there is a significant amount of these SDRs to be rechanneled to countries in greatest need, as I have urged. Likewise, the G20's Debt Service Suspension Initiative and the Common Framework for Debt Treatment have potential to ease the debt crisis, but they are not sufficient. The DSSI should be extended into next year and made available to all middle-income countries that need it, and private finance must also be part of the solution. More generally, we must stop trying to adjust the crisis to the tools and start adjusting the tools to the crisis. The current dynamics of global debt mean rich countries can borrow cheaply and spend their way to recovery, while low and middle-income countries struggle to keep their economies afloat. Without debt relief, many countries will be in an unsustainable financial situation, and their people will pay with their lives and with years of poverty and hunger for this failure of global solidarity. No government should be forced to choose between servicing its debts and serving its people. In the longer term, I renew my call for reforms to remedy long-standing weaknesses and injustices in international debt architecture and end the deadly cycles of debt waves, global debt crises, and lost decades. This starts with a time-bound open dialogue with all stakeholders to build trust and transparency. Our initiative on financing for development, convened jointly with the governments of Canada and Jamaica, yielded many innovative options. Mesdames et messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representatives, while the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed a global economic and social crisis, this happened due to a general lack of investment in social protection and basic services. A new social contract, as proposed in my report on our common agenda, should be at the heart of recovery efforts. In order to break the cycles of deprivation, we need to invest strategically in decent work and climate action with solid social protection system as the basis. A just transition towards renewable energies represent enormous potential to create jobs and reduce inequality in all its forms. All national programs and budgets must be based on, or at the very least, aligned with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. The world needs universal social protection by 2030, including universal health care, income protection, education and skills training, particularly for women and girls. Over the last 18 months, we have seen how much supporting persons in times of difficulty makes a difference. The many ad hoc and temporary measures that have been implemented over the past year provide a good starting point. However, to achieve a job-rich recovery and a just transition, we must mobilize significant public and private investments. Some $1.2 trillion are necessary to achieve universal social protection coverage for low and middle income countries. This will not be possible without broader international solidarity. As part of our efforts to support countries in all these areas, I am pleased to announce the creation of a new global accelerator on jobs and social protection for a just transition in collaboration with the International Labour Organization. This global accelerator will aim to create at least 400 million jobs by 2030, primarily in the green and care economies, and extend social protection floors by 2025 to 50% of people currently not covered.
Ladies and gentlemen, the forthcoming meetings of the international financial institutions, the G20, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and COP26 will be a pivotal moment to put the world on a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive path. Global cooperation is indispensable to building resilience to future shocks through economies that work for everyone. I wish you an excellent debate, and I thank you.
It's a very big thank you to you, Mr. Secretary General, for those remarks. And of course, reminding us that we have the opportunity to make sure that this decade is not lost to development. You've highlighted a number of pathways that we can choose, and you've made sure that it is a deliberate choice in the way you have framed it. And I certainly believe that many of the issues you've put on the table are issues that are going to be engaged with today. I now turn to His Excellency, the Prime Minister, that's Prime Minister Andrew Holness, who is, of course, the Prime Minister of Jamaica. We know that he has long advocated for access to finance for all countries. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jamaica, together with the Prime Minister of Canada, we know, also called for extensive debt relief and concessional support as co-convener of the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative. And so at this moment, I'd like to extend the floor to yourself, and that is, of course, Your Excellency, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Prime Minister Holness. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for well over a year, the COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked havoc on the social and economic fabric of countries. The labor market has not been left unscathed and has seen millions of jobs lost around the world, resulting in unprecedented pressure on social protection systems. I want to thank Secretary General Guterres for convening this high-level event under the aegis of the Financing for Development initiative. I also thank the International Labour Organization for its leadership on this issue. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically changed the way people work. For many white-collar workers, it has meant remote work. For blue-collar workers and workers in service industries, it has provided a glimpse into the future of increasing reliance on technology and automation. At the same time, the pandemic has led to a long overdue revaluation of the significance and essential nature of workers in the health and education sectors. In developing economies in particular, the pandemic has exposed the risks related to the informal economy and the associated lack of social protection. As we chart a new course towards economic recovery, we must lay the foundations for a more resilient labor market and a more equal world. We must invest in upskilling and reskilling our workers for the jobs of the future to better prepare for the disruptions of the fourth industrial revolution, which the pandemic has only served to accelerate. The pandemic has also exposed the stark inequalities and significant gaps in social protection systems. With the onslaught of the pandemic, many low and middle-income countries have struggled to mount a social protection and stimulus response of the scope and scale required to meet the need. In particular, highly indebted middle-income countries like my own country have had to apply an unprecedented number of social protection and job policies interventions to alleviate the effects of the crisis on our population, while being severely constrained by our fiscal challenges. Despite these constraints, within 2 weeks of the first case of the COVID-19 pandemic in Jamaica, we instituted a support program for the vulnerable, poor, elderly, and disabled, workers and businesses, to cushion the economic impact of the pandemic. This was the largest social support program in Jamaica's history. In July 2021, we implemented a new social pension program for seniors 75 years and older, and were not in receipt of a pension. These were necessary measures to mitigate the destabilizing socioeconomic effects of the crisis on our population. Strengthening and enabling the social protection system to be responsive and agile during crises will be key to accelerating efforts towards ending poverty and vulnerabilities. Excellencies, even as we endure the pandemic, climate-related disasters have exacerbated current challenges. They also create new ones, such as changing the labor market landscape due to job losses and the need for new skills and training to meet the shifts to the green economy. COP26 in Glasgow provides a platform for integrating the pillars of decent work, namely social dialogue, social protection, rights at work, and employment, into the implementation of our climate action policies. The Paris Agreement recognizes the imperatives of a just transition, which would ensure that carbon neutral economies are adequately protected and that opportunities for the creation of decent and green jobs are fully seized. Investment in specific green sectors will have a substantial potential for creating sizable net gains in employment, while simultaneously protecting the environment. Such a strategy must be reinforced by robust social protection systems to support workers in their transition to jobs in these new sectors. Given the urgent need to address these pressing and interrelated challenges, we call for action-oriented engagement among policymakers at all levels to bridge the financing gaps and to implement innovative solutions that support sustainable development and eradicate poverty. The pandemic has laid bare the inadequacies and inequalities in our existing economic and social systems. It has brought into sharp focus the fundamental value of human life and human potential. As we seek to build forward stronger and better, let us seize this opportunity to invest in our most precious asset, our human capital. I thank you.
We thank you, Prime Minister of Jamaica, for your remarks and your reminder and a call for action-orientated engagement. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I now have the pleasure to turn to Mr. Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, to help us set the scene for today's discussion with his remarks. Of course, Mr. Ryder was elected as ILO Director General by the ILO's governing body in 2012 and re-elected in 2016. He has pledged to position the organization as a determined actor translating principle into action, just as we've heard from the Prime Minister, and ensuring that it has the capacity to make major differences in the lives of working people on all of the continents. And so with that introduction, Mr. Guy Ryder, the floor is yours.
Secretary General, Prime Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured to follow Secretary General Guterres and Prime Minister Holness in introducing this high-level event on jobs and social protection for poverty eradication, and I particularly want to thank Jamaica and Canada for their crucial leadership in the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative. The pandemic is continuing to take human lives across the globe, but it has also thrown the world into profound economic and social crisis, adding to the suffering and the misery that it has inflicted. In 2020, the equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs were destroyed, and 3.7 trillion billion US dollars was wiped off income from labour. The impact has been 4 times greater than that of the great financial crisis of 2008-2009. The struggle to overcome the virus continues, but the pressing need before us now is to act to stimulate economic recovery, which is inclusive, sustainable and resilient, and which puts the world on track to deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And to do this, I think that we must learn the lessons of the last year and a half, and 2 of these lessons are already glaringly apparent. Firstly, that the human cost of the pandemic has been a direct consequence of past policy failures. The world was unprepared and millions were vulnerable because the majority of people had no social protection whatsoever, because 6 out of every 10 were in the informal economy, because we had failed to invest in the basics of human security. The unprecedented response measures put in place by governments, including nearly 1,700 ad hoc protection measures, have certainly provided emergency relief for many. But the question is, what happens next? And that brings us to the second lesson. It is, of course, encouraging that the world has returned to an economic growth trajectory, but it is equally alarming that it is so dramatically uneven, because the advanced countries have both the fiscal firepower to boost recovery, and because they have access to vaccines, they are, notwithstanding the great uncertainties and obstacles of the moment, bouncing back towards pre-crisis macroeconomic aggregates. But the situation for many of the developing and emerging economies is very different. And this means, as the Secretary General has reminded us, that the world is on a path of a great divergence, which, if not corrected, would mean the exact opposite of leaving no one behind, the contrary of building back better, an abandonment of the commitments of the 2030 Agenda, a world of heightened inequality, poverty, instability, and conflict. The Secretary General has already highlighted what the consequences of this would be and pointed us towards the alternative of renewed global solidarity and a renewed social contract in our common agenda. This General Assembly, together with the international institutions participating today, are uniquely placed to inject the financing and the political will to reset the recovery process accordingly. The Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection proposed by the Secretary General is designed to help us do just this, to channel national and international, public and private financial flows to provide social protection floors for the 4 billion people who fall outside any existing coverage, and to the creation of decent jobs, above all, in the green economy and the care economy on the scale which is now urgently needed. The level of ambition is high because it would be irresponsible to be less ambitious. The operationalization of the Accelerator can build on solid foundations which are already in place. The Climate Action for Jobs initiative can and must be scaled up to promote just transition to carbon neutrality as we head for COP26. And the USP 2030 Global Partnership must be the rallying point for universal social protection. Excellencies, the advances made through the Financing for Development initiative likewise need to be taken forward and to scale, not just to alleviate imminent debt crisis, but to unleash investment in inclusive recovery. And the IMF's allocation of $650 billion in special drawing rights provides extraordinary opportunity for us to match needs with resources. And the Accelerator provides a mechanism for this. The global call to action for a human-centered recovery adopted by the ILO's conference last June commits our organization to work with all others in the international system to these ends. We will be convening national dialogues in our member states for maximum ownership and buy-in to national recovery strategies, and a multilateral forum early next year with a view to reviewing progress and to scaling up commitments. These, ladies and gentlemen, can be our milestones on the way to the World Social Summit proposed by the Secretary General for 2025. But this is a road that we need to design and to finance today. Thank you very much.
I thank the Director General for his remarks. And of course, the question that he puts to us was, beyond emergency relief, what happens next? And the opportunity, of course, for us to respond to that. And so, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do exactly that by transitioning now from our opening remarks to our very first panel discussion. Now, as I set the scene for this panel discussion, let us be reminded that when the pandemic crisis began, the IMF's managing director, Madame Georgieva, called on countries to spend all they could and then spend a bit more, but keep the receipts for accountability. And so as we head into the third year of the crisis, we are seeing, as the Director General indicated, a great divergence, which is now emerging between those countries that were able to spend extensively on social protection and other measures to protect lives and livelihoods, and those that were constrained in their response due to tightened fiscal environments and large debt burdens. In addition to this, ladies and gentlemen, 255 million full-time jobs were lost, resulting in $3.7 trillion in labor income losses. And to close the fiscal stimulus gap for economic and labor market recovery in low and middle income countries, $982 billion are needed. And so, just as we've heard, 1,700 new social protection measures were implemented during the pandemic. 4.4 billion individuals remain, however, unprotected by any form of social protection measure. This amounts to 53.1% of the global population. Many were adopted on the assumption of a one-year crisis, and that assumption, we are learning, was wrong and has given rise to the macroeconomic challenge that our high-level panelists will speak to now. And so the theme of this panel is macroeconomic policies to finance green jobs and social protection. Joining me in this panel is Madame Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Mr. David Malpass, the President of the World Bank Group, Mr. Matthias Cormann, the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Ms. Alicia Barcena, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, Mr. Mauricio Claver-Carone, who is the President of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mr. Muhammad Suleiman Al-Jasser, the President of the Islamic Development Bank, Mr. Akunwumi Adesina, the President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Ikem Steiner, the Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, and Ms. Mafalda Duarte, the CEO of the Climate Investment Funds. It's a massive welcome to all of you. I'm going to get straight into it, and I'm going to come to Madame Georgieva first with the first question to you, Madame. So we know that In August, the IMF's allocation of SDRs, or the special drawing rights, added about $650 billion to the official reserve assets of its member countries, countries that the IMF categorizes as advanced economies, received some $400 billion, much of which has been argued is not needed as additional reserves. We've heard several proposals that have been made for how these countries might use the windfall to benefit developing countries, including by lending them back to the IMF trust funds. Another proposal, of course, has been to spend those non-SDR reserves for international, social, and green economy support, now that these countries have the additional SDRs in their reserve accounts. The question to you, Madam, is this: what is the role of SDRs in supporting countries during the recovery, and what else can the international community do to secure a green, inclusive, and just economic transition? Over to you, Madam.
Thank you very much, and my gratitude to the Secretary General, to the Prime Minister of Jamaica, for keeping us together. The crisis is not yet over, and as the Secretary General said in the very beginning, we are faced with a dangerous divergence in economic fortunes within countries and across countries. Cannot allow this to undermine the fabric on which societies and the world economy relies. To answer your question, when we look at the problem we face, what is underpinning this divergence? It is very clear that there are two main factors. One, policy space, fiscal space. Two, how fast vaccinations are progressing, how is the pandemic being contained. We have to address both. The SDRs on their own, by the very virtue of being now available to countries, give a boost to liquidity, give a boost to that capacity to have the fiscal space and use some of it for health spending. But as the Secretary General said, because of the way we distribute the SDRs, countries in very strong position get a relatively high share. And the question that immediately arises is, what can they do more to help the rest of the world? We have been discussing with our members in strong positions, for voluntary on-lending of SDRs so they can go where there is the biggest need. And I was extremely pleased with President Macron announcing just a couple of days ago that France is going to direct 20% of their new SDR allocation with a primary focus on Africa. What I have heard gives me confidence that many others will follow. Not all countries can do it because of domestic legislative reasons, but those that can do it are actively looking into ways to help the world economy, do the right thing for countries in need, but also do the right thing for themselves, because we have to come out of this crisis together. What is being pursued? One, the IMF has an existing trust, poverty reduction and growth trust, that has proven in this crisis so highly valuable. We have tripled support for low-income countries through concessional financing. And I can say with confidence that I see somewhere between 25 to 35 billion injection to expand the capacity for low-income countries. Two, we are proposing to the membership the creation of a new resilience and sustainability trust that would expand the coverage of countries and will be oriented towards providing longer term, so more appropriate to address the climate crisis, to build resilience, to support massive structural transformation financing. And we are advancing the discussions on this resilience and sustainability trust. I hear from quite a number of members very strong interest to support it. 3, we're looking into ways in which SDRs could reinforce the capacity of multilateral development banks so they can step up their own action. And to finish, what more can we do? We can do more on debt. And together with the World Bank, we are working on how to make the common framework more effective, more operational. We at the fund are extending debt relief for our poorest members so they don't have to pay us at that time of heavy pressure on their budgets. And we have to concentrate on the right policies in countries, because in the end, this is what would make a difference. Strong system of social protection. You spoke about that. We do have to extend it. Capacity to create more vibrant private sector, jobs and growth. Public investment to unleash green and digital investments. And doing this always with an eye how we can create more jobs. How can education deliver skills, not for yesterday, but for tomorrow? And the IMF is engaged at all levels to pursue the right policies and to make sure that all we do in this crisis is to give an amplifier to all our measures, including the SDRs. And my thanks to all the members, and my thanks to the Secretary General, who has been a big advocate for the SDR allocation. We made it happen. We would amplify its impact. Thank you.
Madame Georgieva, some of your keywords, amplifying impact. And of course, you've built on what we heard from Prime Minister Holness in that action-orientated engagement, really outlining to us the interventions that are underway, that are in the pipeline, that are already on the factory floor. And so with that, allow me then to go to Mr. Malpas with this next question. To you, sir, we know that the major economies had more or less coordinated expansion to counter the contraction of the pandemic, including through an unparalleled social protection policy response. We also know that in 2020, about 1,700 social protection measures were put in place globally. Nevertheless, expansive policies were adopted on the assumption of a one-year and a temporary crisis, while many low and middle-income countries were unable to mount a proportionate social protection and stimulus response. To you, sir, the question is this: how should we capitalize on the social protection adopted during the pandemic to build permanently stronger and more resilient systems with wider population coverage, albeit recognizing that additional domestic revenue mobilization is needed for the sustainability of these systems? And while you answer, I wonder if you might also just comment on the role of the World Bank and whether the bank sees this as a priority.
Secretary General Guterres, Excellencies, and distinguished colleagues, thank you for convening today's important event on jobs and social protection. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the labor market and highlighted the challenge of creating jobs. It has caused devastating job loss and a reversal in labor income. It has also stressed social protection systems. We're confronting a looming era of reversals of the development achievements of the last decades. The World Bank has worked with countries to promote social protection, livelihoods and jobs, and financial inclusion investments. Since the start of the pandemic, global social protection programs have been expanded at an unprecedented scale. More than 200 countries have deployed more than 3,000 social protection and labor measures. Relative to pre-COVID levels, programs doubled the amount of cash provided to beneficiaries, and coverage more than tripled on average. In response to COVID-19 severely damaging the lives and livelihoods of millions of people in developing countries, the World Bank Group deployed over $157 billion to fight the pandemic's health, economic, and social impacts. Social protection and jobs operations have increased significantly to over $10 billion, reaching more than 1 billion individuals worldwide. We are working with partners to help countries recover in ways that will be sustainable, greener, and more prosperous. It's clear that transformative economic growth will be the ultimate driver of poverty reduction, but it's critical that growth be inclusive and broad-based. The pandemic offers an opportunity for countries to integrate economic growth and inclusion into their development strategies for poverty reduction and job creation. This shift requires that countries address long-term challenges, but also a step change towards environmental sustainability and strengthening human capital. There are 5 critical areas we need to focus on even as the world of work is rapidly changing due to technological and demographic change, climate change, urbanization, and globalization. First, we should promote structural reforms and job creation in industries with the potential to grow and where employment gains can be large, realizing those opportunities require significant and deliberate investments today. Second, we should support skills development to meet changing labor market needs, including addressing the learning losses due to COVID-19 and ramping up programs that meet growing demand, such as digital skills. Third, we should confront labor market inequalities head-on by being more thoughtful in the design of policies to support the most vulnerable and addressing the significant disability and gender gaps that persist in labor force participation and earnings. Fourth, we need to build social protection systems that protect everyone. The COVID-19 crisis has underlined the absence of effective schemes to protect informal workers. Governments should consider developing integrated, universal social protection systems to support both the goal of achieving universal social protection by 2030 and the goal of accelerating the growth of better jobs. Fifth, we need to harness the investments made during the pandemic and continue strengthening social protection systems by building resilience against future crises. Existing cash transfer investments provide a cost-effective foundation to build on. The use of technology and institutional strengthening, like social registries or early warning systems, have made delivery systems more inclusive, adaptive, and efficient. Digital solutions can help leapfrog some delivery constraints and increase cost effectiveness. As co-chair of the Universal Social Protection 2030 Partnership, I would like to conclude by stressing that international collaboration on jobs and social protection is vital. The World Bank welcomes the opportunity to be part of this dialogue and to continue our support for countries in their quest for a more sustainable, prosperous, and inclusive world of work.
It's a massive thank you to Mr. Malpass, and we transition in this conversation now to hear from Mr. Corman. And the question is straightforward to you, sir. What should governments consider to ensure COVID-19 recovery plans foster a job-rich and sustainable recovery? And as you reflect on that question, might you also comment on what concrete advice can the OECD provide in this regard? Over to you, Mr. Corman.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Secretary General Guterres, distinguished guests, colleagues. I'm really pleased to join today's discussion on the importance of building a job-rich and sustainable recovery. Our green recovery database here at the OECD shows that about $677 billion US has been earmarked for environmentally positive recovery measures. And according to estimates of the International Energy Agency, one of the agencies here in the OECD family, if well designed and implemented, such measures could help create up to 2.5 million new jobs. However, the important transition to a green economy can, of course, also cause some challenging transitions in the labor market. And so I'll focus on 3 priorities to meet those transition challenges. First, we need to connect people to those jobs. Employment and training services will need to be integrated, comprehensive and individualized. We need to expand active labour market policies to connect job seekers to available jobs. How can we better connect job seekers, in particular those most at risk of long-term unemployment, to the many new opportunities flowing from the green transition? It may require measures such as well-targeted and temporary hiring subsidies. And on the flip side, to help startups and new businesses succeed, may require better and more innovative ways to connect them with the talents and skills that they need. Which brings me to the second important priority. Collectively, we need to improve our upskilling, reskilling and skills matching effort. Investing in effective skills policies to help workers transition to the growing sectors of the green economy, to match them up with jobs in areas likely to experience severe skills shortages, for example, in the renewable energy sector, in energy and resource efficiency related industries, or in environmental services. We must redouble our efforts to promote a culture of lifelong learning, leverage training programs to address bottlenecks to participation, and strengthen career guidance to inform young people and adults about job prospects in emerging green sectors. And we must engage those who need training the most. In the context of the digitalization of our economy, it is striking that workers whose jobs are most at risk of automation, they're only half as likely to engage in adult learning compared to their peers in jobs with a lower risk of automation. We need to engage those workers better, and that's a second very important priority. Thirdly and finally, closing gaps in social protection systems, and this has been mentioned during the discussion already. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the gaps when it comes to effective social protection, in particular for non-standard workers. But even before the pandemic, in several countries, workers on non-standard contracts were 40 to 50% less likely to benefit from unemployment benefits when out of work. COVID recovery packages have given us a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build a better world of work, to create new green jobs and stronger, more adequate social safety nets. And I can assure you that you can count on the OECD to support better policies for better lives across all of these important areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And those three guidelines are loud and clear: connect people to jobs, upskill, reskill efforts. We need to improve our actions there, and then close the gaps in the social protection system. Thank you very much. I'm going to navigate my way now to Ms. Bosena. And the question that I'd like to bring to you is, if progress was made in the area of ending illicit financial flows and strengthening tax policy, what impact would it have on budgets and on expanding fiscal space to finance these and other development priorities that we've been talking about? And perhaps as a secondary question to that is to ask, and what do you think needs to happen at the national and global levels to make an impact? Over to you, Madam.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank the Secretary General and God Ryder for this invitation. And I really want to refer also to the policy brief, which I think it's a very interesting one. I want to say that illicit funds are in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the region I represent, are it represents 6.1% of GDP, which is that we are losing every year a very, very high amount of resources that could be devoted to a different purpose. So the first thing we need to do is to tackle tax avoidance and illicit financial flows, which are key barriers to domestic resource mobilization. We're talking about $325 billion a year. And this will require initially international cooperation, because all this evasion and tax avoidance goes to certain other countries, right? Then illicit financial flows that arise from the manipulation of international trade in goods are estimated to reach $85 billion, 1.6% of GDP. So, and many of these are linked to products that are part of the global value chain. So, and the third action that I think we need urgently is to expand the universe of multinational companies where high minimum corporate taxes of 15% can apply, and better distribution between developed and developing countries. Now, why I want to say a couple of things. That debt alleviation is one of the major things that we need, especially in the Caribbean. And I just want to make a point that we are proposing to alleviate 12% of the total debt of the Caribbean to create the Caribbean Resilience Fund. And also to the other question we would like to pose here, now that we are talking about issuance of special drawing rights, which we welcome very much, but we believe there has to be accompanied by a voluntary recycling of unused SDRs from developed to developing countries. And this recycling of SDRs should also be explored to create a middle income trust fund and where development banks and regional financial institutions can act. Because regions like mine, which is the most highly indebted of the world, I have to say, of the developing world, today is also paying 59% of their exports of goods and services into debt service. So these are some key issues that we need to do, because this is a region that is confronting structural gaps, inequality, underfunded health systems, and of course, structural accumulated gaps on social protection. And issues like informality and inequality affecting basically women and youth. So we need to liberate these funds from illicit funding, from tax avoidance, from concessional funding to middle-income countries, and debt alleviation to allow them to have more fiscal space. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Madame Barcena, as you speak to those interventions that would widen the fiscal space, and of course, putting on the table the voluntary recycling of unused SDRs as something that we need to be talking about as well. And so I'm going to go from your region to another region now as I go to Mr. Clever Caron. And the question I'd like to bring to you, sir, is this. From your perspective of the region, what role do you see for regional development banks like the IADB for achieving socio-economic recovery that can bolster social protection and a just transition for all in the process? And might you also comment, sir, on what macroeconomic policies do you think are needed to achieve this goal? Over to you.
Hey, thanks so much for the question. It's actually a nice segue because we are actually in the same region as Alicia there. But thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Secretary General Gutierrez, for allowing us to share and based on your question, what the Inter-American Development Bank's perspective is on, frankly, what is our region's, being Latin America and the Caribbean, sustainable growth imperative. So as you know, Latin America and the Caribbean, as Alicia mentioned, has been the region hardest hit by COVID-19 in terms of death per capita. And similarly, the pandemic has had really a profound impact on our labor markets. At the worst of the pandemic, more than 31 million people in our region were out of work and over 50 million people dropped out of the middle class, eroding a decade of progress in that sense. At the same time, we also face the existential threat of climate change, where 4 out of 5 countries most affected by natural disasters are in Latin America and the Caribbean, the upheavals of migration, deep-seated inequality, unprecedented debt challenges, and persistent corruption. But here at the IDB, and I'm always an optimist, and I'm a defiant optimist, we also see great momentum on the other side of the crisis and ripe opportunities to reinvest in a better future. Our single-minded pursuit is to help our borrowing member countries realize those opportunities to accelerate recovery and create the conditions for sustainable and inclusive growth. Here at the IDB, we launched our Vision 2025, which is a blueprint for recovery, investment, and jobs. And we identified 5 key areas, including 1, regional integration and strengthening of value chains, a tremendous multi-generational opportunity, digitalization, again, a multi-generational opportunity, small business enhancement, gender equality and diversity, and action on climate change. Focusing our work on these areas is going to help overcome longstanding challenges to climate action and social protection, and it's going to reactivate the productive sector, re-energize employment, including for women, and boost skill development, which are core components of our country's structural labor market challenges that, well, obviously existed well before the pandemic. So we're working to advance these priorities with concrete actions. For example, we provided financing for some of the most pandemic-affected sectors in Brazil. We're supporting institutional reforms that favor green jobs in Ecuador. And we're helping improve regulations that support effective, inclusive digitalization of the economy in Colombia. Here at the IDB, we will also continue to pursue developments that have potential to really revolutionize how the international investment community and countries around the world address biodiversity loss and climate change, and ensure tools are available to do so in a business-friendly manner. Investing for recovery that is sustainable both socially and environmentally is truly a win-win strategy with the potential to add millions of jobs and increase economic growth while reducing climate risks before it's too late. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win. And indeed, the IDB and the ILO, we found that the path toward decarbonization create 15 million net new jobs in our region by 2030 in areas such as plant-based food production, renewable energy, construction, manufacturing. So public spending to help firms and households recover can prioritize environmentally sound investments to relocate workers to these green sectors. And that's the message we're sending with every single project loan interaction with our countries. Updating fiscal strategies and aligning regulations and prices with environmental goals is key, as is designing holistic climate plans. And we're taking an aggressive approach on this. Additionally, here at the IDB, we're leading efforts in our region to better integrate efforts to implement reforms to boost employment, increase protection against risk, and promote female labor participation, because it's essential that our projects also factor in the differential impact the pandemic has on women who have really borne the brunt of lockdowns and economic stagnation. This year, we launched an employment action framework with a gender perspective to accelerate the recovery, creation, and transformation of jobs for women through technology. So really, thank you for this opportunity. And together with even stronger collaboration with the UN, the ILO, and all OECD, all other organizations represented here today, I am confident, very confident that we can set a course for a brighter future. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Claver-Carone, and of course, indicating to us how those 5 key areas are coming alive through the interventions and the action. And of course, thank you so much. We are in the same region as Madame Bassena, but maybe to stay within the theme of regional development banks, allow me now to go to Mr. Al-Jasser. And the question that I'd like to bring to you, sir, is what role do you see for regional development banks like the Islamic Development Bank for achieving a socio-economic recovery, including by bolstering social protection and decent work in the green and the care economies? And as a follow-up to that, I'm keen to also hear from you, what role do you think SDRs can play in that regard? Over to you, Mr. Jasser.
Unmute, please.
Yes, sorry. Thanks for the question. Mr. Secretary General, the distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I would like to thank His Excellency, the Secretary General, for this invitation to participate in this high-level event. As a South-South multilateral development bank, the Islamic Development Bank promotes inclusive socioeconomic development in its 57 member countries. The Islamic Development Bank recognizes the need to strengthen cooperation to support regional and national capacities of developing and low-income countries to accelerate the creation of decent and green jobs and enhance social protection systems. The Islamic Development Bank Group has designated $4.56 billion for the Strategic Preparedness and Response Program to tackle the COVID-19 impact. Through the holistic approach of the SPRP, we provide emergency assistance to support health systems and extend finance to micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises to rehabilitate livelihoods, build resilience, and create jobs. The Islamic Development Bank and the other 10 MDBs in 2021 committed about $230 billion to provide more resources to address the pandemic fallout. Concerning the bank's role in social, climate, and green finance, I am pleased to note that in 2019, the Islamic Development Bank launched the first ever AAA rated green sukuk, which is the equivalent to bonds, raising 1 billion euros and $1.5 billion in 2020 to tackle the impact of the COVID-19. The bank also issued the largest sustainability sukuk, raising $2.5 billion to finance green and social development projects. Furthermore, during 2020, the $10 billion Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development, the bank's poverty reduction arm, intensified its support to member countries. In 2021, the Islamic Development Bank joined the well-recognized global initiative on decent jobs for youth, which the International Labour Organization launched to address youth employment. We commend the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection for pushing the boundaries by setting ambitious targets. These include financing job creation, supporting the shift from informality to formality, and extending social protection for disadvantaged groups in the informal sector. We trust that through the coordinated efforts of all partners under this initiative, we can first create integrated and coherent regional and national policies. Second, intensify our dialogue with the private sector to scale up investments and public-private partnerships. Third, utilize innovative financing to expand social protection and support youth entrepreneurship. Fourth, create a future-proof workforce and increase secure employment by overcoming the skills mismatch, reskilling people, reintegrating youth who lost jobs into the economy, and reducing the gender pay gap. Fifth, increase financial inclusion of women and youth and improve their financial literacy. Sixth, engage all stakeholders, including women and youth, to understand their aspirations and needs. Seventh, speed up the pace of technology absorption to reduce the digital divide. And finally, eighth, and most importantly, introduce accountable and transparent mechanisms to ensure effective deployment and utilization of resources. Of course, as you have asked in the final question, the SDR is a great asset for the world. It has been used before to help the developing countries. And I think the initiative by France may be a good start. And we will be watching what transpires from the discussions that will be held during the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. But the Islamic Development Bank always stands ready to cooperate with all multilateral institutions to ensure that we do the most that we can in cooperation to alleviate the impact of this dreadful pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Jasser, for sharing 8 concrete actions, and again also amplifying and bringing back to the spotlight the example that we saw from President Macron that has been shared, and asking the question, of course, can this be replicated? And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going now to Mr. Adesina from the African Development Bank, and the question to Mr. Adesina is, what types of investment are required to help Africa make a transition to job-rich growth, particularly for young people and youth as a category?
Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank His Excellency, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and His Excellency Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, for inviting me to address this important event on jobs and social protection for poverty eradication. The COVID-19 pandemic has drastically affected the economies of Africa, with GDP growth rate declining by 2.1% in 2020, the lowest in over 2 decades. Poverty and joblessness have increased. An additional 30 million people have fallen further into poverty, while over 30 million jobs have been lost, worsening the already high unemployment levels. While the economic growth rate is expected to rise to 3.4% this year, that is still far lower than the level needed to boost jobs recovery on the continent. Today, 83% of the 18 million youth that enter the labor market each year are jobless or underemployed in the informal sector with low productivity. Furthermore, poverty is pervasive among the youth in Africa, with over 70% of the young people working in sub-Saharan Africa and 25% in North Africa living under extreme or moderate poverty, according to the International Labour Organization. We must therefore ensure that Africa grows back better in ways that create a lot more quality and decent jobs for its predominantly young population. Gainfully employed youth, supported with access to social protection, including quality health and social security, will stabilize and power African economies today and well into the future. The African Continental Free Trade Area, expected to have consumer and business expenditures of up to $6.7 trillion by 2030, presents huge opportunities for jobs. These will, however, require greater investments in specialized high-end and low-end technical and vocational skills to support industrialization. Rapid development in information and communications technology is also changing the nature of work as demand for digital skills is expanding, changing the nature of jobs of the future. The African Development Bank's Jobs for Youth strategy set the goal of creating 25 million jobs and equipping at least 50 million youth with skills to realize their economic potential by 2025. This will be achieved through promoting inclusive employment, entrepreneurship, strengthening human capital, and creating durable labor market linkages. The bank is also investing heavily in upskilling in digital education, as well as in sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which will power the jobs of the future. Through the bank's Coding for Employment program, we are developing a critical mass of digitally enabled youth that can help power Africa's fourth industrial revolution. We are establishing 133 digital coding centers to train 230,000 youth with digital skills needed for the digital jobs of today and tomorrow, in partnership with Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Through the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, developed by the African Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation, we have launched a youth adaptation flagship that will unlock $3 billion for the businesses of young people and support 10,000 youth-led small and medium-sized enterprises in climate resilience while building the capacity of 1 million youth in climate adaptation. To further boost the access of the youth to finance, the bank is currently exploring support to countries for the development of youth entrepreneurship investment banks to create new financial ecosystems to massively build, support, and unleash the talents and entrepreneurship of the youth across the continent. The African Development Bank will invest $700 million over the next 4 years to support skills development for Africa's youth. We must do more than give hope for the youth. We must deliver on their hopes and aspirations. Let's invest in the youth today and build for them a much healthier, better, and secure future. The youth are Africa's demographic advantage. Now, let's turn them into a well-skilled, well-trained workforce for Africa and the world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you to Mr. Adesina. We must give more than hope. We have to deliver on that hope is the rallying call to action. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm turning my focus now to Mr. Steiner as we take the question to the UNDP. Mr. Steiner, the question to you is, given the fact that the UN has been working with key partners, including the EU and the IFIs, to support countries in developing integrated national financing frameworks, and of course, this to assess the financing flows and needs to implement national sustainable development strategies, the question to you, sir, is how can these efforts be strengthened and support SDG budgeting towards implementation of national sustainable development strategies? And might you also comment on whether there are trade-offs to investing in jobs, social protection, and climate And I suppose the big question is, can we do it all? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nazifa. And I realize that the time has already slightly progressed. I see Prime Minister De Croo and others ready for the next panel. So let me be very brief, echo what the speakers before me have already said, and respond to your question specifically. But I think what is important with any discussion about jobs and social protection at this moment is always to remind ourselves, before anything else, right now, we have to address vaccine equity. The best way to get jobs back, the best way to get social protection either established or expanded is to actually get vaccinations done. So much of the last week here in New York, there was a lot of discussions about this. I think any kind of summit and discussion about jobs has to begin with getting those vaccines out there, because that is the shortcut to getting our economies going again. Now, the second point is the integrated national financing frameworks are essentially a tool to assist countries to get a better overview of both domestic public and private and international public and private and concessional financing. And this is essential because virtually in every country right now, massive attempts to stimulate the economy, but also to leave no one behind, to deal with those who are most exposed, including those who are not in the formal job market. And Guy Ryder and I often discuss this, the informal sector. People who have no safety net, have no income guarantee, they are part of that challenge that fiscal space must address. And I think what is critical is to realize that very hard choices have to be made. We can only borrow our way forward out of this crisis up to a point. Already 60 countries are in essentially a highly debt distressed situation. That number will grow in the coming months and year. So choices are acutely important. And that is why I believe that beyond the numbers, and we've heard a lot of numbers this morning, there are some real choices to be made. Social protection actually speaks to something that well before the pandemic had already become in many countries an issue of great political contention. Our social contracts, the fabric that holds us together as societies, was beginning to rupture. We saw politics step onto the streets because people did not believe that equity and fairness were represented in that. And social protection certainly is a key public policy area in which, as we speak about building back better, or as we sometimes in UNDP say, build forward better, this is a choice that has to be made very explicitly. We can express it in hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, but first of all, there is a political choice. How much inequality do you accept as a price for economic growth, or is it actually a trade-off? And the second part, which I think we have seen repeatedly also alluded to here this morning, thinking about how to invest into the future recovery must be inextricably linked to a green transition, a green economy, an inclusive green economy. And I think that answers your second point, Nasifo. This is not a time of trade-offs, it's a time of choices. The choices are not so much whether you invest in coal-fired power or renewable energy. I think the choices are fairly self-evident. The question is, are we going to invest in an economy that only benefits those who are at the top of an economic pyramid, or are we going to invest in the recovery, greater resilience, and less risks in the future of those who are often the majority, or at least the most vulnerable in our society? So it's a choice between greater inequality or more equity, and secondly, between sustainability or simply a return to business as usual. And that is where financing is obviously a critical arena that will allow both job creation, greater job security and livelihood security, but also an economy that can actually create the kind of livelihoods that we need in the future. So let me stop here. That is at the core of, I think, much of what we're discussing. And certainly with UNDP, we are working alongside our country partners and our sister agencies very much in helping governments now to define those choices in terms of practical steps, because there is not enough money. You can only borrow a certain amount, and therefore you begin to have to set very different priorities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steiner. A lot packed into that concise response as you remind us that it's not about trade-offs, but it's more about deliberate choices and then being practical about those choices. And so with that, allow me to go to Madame Duarte as I bring this question to you. What type of public investments specifically are needed to rebuild economies and to boost long-term growth potential that delivers social equity and a just transition? Over to you, Madam.
Thank you, Nasifo, and Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, because we now see you on screen. ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. We have been hearing this morning consistently about the challenges before us and the fact that these challenges are quite breathtaking. We've also been hearing that this pandemic has caused the loss of more than 4.5 million lives, more than 250 million jobs, and the first reversal of poverty reduction in over 2 decades. This sharp increase in poverty and inequalities is disproportionately impacting women, youth, low-skilled, and informal workers. We know as well, we've heard it this morning, that more than $16 trillion have been invested as a response to this crisis, but they are falling short in terms of tackling these persistent social inequalities and propelling the green recovery. Secretary General also mentioned that nearly 85% of government spending to mitigate the effects of the crisis has been invested in developed countries, while developing countries are being disproportionately impacted by the current pandemic and by climate change impacts, as Prime Minister from Jamaica also stressed. And these are the countries that, because of the severe fiscal constraints, are prevented from adequately responding to both challenges. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand that there will not be a solution to our climate crisis without developing countries, because they are on track to run on 70% of the world's energy supply, and they represent 60% of total GDP. And because it is in developing countries where 2/3 of the forecasted $90 trillion of infrastructure investments will be made in the years to come. So today, we need to make history by really investing in lasting structural change, in equitable and transformational climate action at an unprecedented scale and speed, in transitions that need to be socially just within countries and across countries. This is really the only way to ensure that the SDGs are met. It is hard, and words on their own will not do it, but bold decisions and smart investments can. They have done it in the past, and they can do it now. For more than a decade, the Climate Investment Funds has partnered with multilateral development banks, governments, and private sector to deliver more than $60 billion worth of climate investments across 72 developing countries. And we have demonstrated that well-targeted public climate finance at scale can deliver a significant number of jobs and significant economic value added. But we have also learned that socially just transitions, they won't happen just because we make climate investments. Deliberate actions are needed to ensure that we focus on who gets what and who decides on what. We need to invest in understanding how the transitions will impact the communities and economies, and we need to make investments where they can deliver social impact while meeting our climate goals. We also need to make sure that all relevant institutions and people are heard and involved in decisions, in particular the affected communities. Social justice and climate action are two sides of the same coin, and this is the currency of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Duarte. Some really strong reminders here. There is no solution without developing countries. And you've asked us two very important questions. Who gets what and who decides what? Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, that brings us to the end of our first panel discussion, which was focused on macroeconomic policy to finance green jobs and social protection. And it certainly has been robust in what we've heard so far. And so without further ado, I'm going to transition us now to our second discussion, which is our national and regional commitments to create decent jobs, to expand social protection, and to support a just transitions. And so Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to now turn to this high-level session where we're going to be focusing specifically on these issues. With us today are leaders that play a key role in these areas. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all of our panelists to kindly please limit their remarks to just 3 minutes. To start us off, I'd like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Alexander De Croo, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Belgium and co-chair of the Group of Friends of Decent Work, to set the scene for us. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Director General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first of all to thank the Secretary General for inviting me to launch this session devoted to national and regional commitments for a just transition, decent jobs, and strengthening of social protection. Belgium is one of the founding members of the ILO, and for over 100 years, our support to the ILO has never wavered. For Belgium, the values and the strategic objectives of the ILO provide the very basis of social peace. The ILO survived the Second World War and has since then demonstrated its relevance at all times and in all circumstances. The COVID-19 pandemic has drastically changed the circumstances. It has unfortunately strengthened the inequalities and affected the most vulnerable group the most. But we've also learned a lot. We have seen what the essential contributions are of precarious workers, women and young people that too often we have taken what they are doing for granted. And I think it has become very visible how dependent our societies are on certain types of workers.
Based on its constitutional mandate, the ILO is the organization that is best placed to carry out the work and programs to build back a more equal and sustainable world. We can work there to promote job creation and social dialogue in all circumstances and to adapt labor standards to green and digital transitions so that these standards better protect workers. Universal social protection is another fundamental area of work. The pandemic has once again demonstrated the usefulness of social protective systems in protecting people, economies, and societies. But even today, 4 billion people on the planet still do not enjoy any social protection. We must continue to fight for this. Social protection is not an unrealizable utopia. On the contrary, it is an ambitious but realistic challenge.
In today's globalized value chains, also multinationals have a very important role to play. We see that sectoral initiatives are developing, and we can build on the ILO Declaration on Multinational Enterprises to collectively and clearly define the duties of multinational enterprises with respect to employment, to training, to conditions of work, and to industrial relationships. Dear friends, to be ready to face the future crises, we must collectively strengthen the resilience of our institutions. We must mobilize the Bretton Woods institutions to free up budgetary means for a truly social recovery. And I welcome the recent constructive messages from these organizations. The Global Job Creation and Social Protection Accelerator, initiated by Secretary General Guterres, is a powerful tool to support those initiatives. Belgium will fully support its implementation. The commitments we make here will have to be transmitted to the World Bank and the IMF. They must also be passed on to the G20, to COP26, in order to achieve inclusive reconstruction programs. Let me conclude. This pandemic has and is still challenging us more than ever before, not just to rebuild, but also to do better, to make our societies and our economies fairer, greener, more inclusive, and more sustainable. It is probably the most significant task that we will ever face. So let's get to work and let's do this. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Belgium for his remarks. Let's get to work and let's do this. And that's exactly what we're going to do as we invite now our different leaders who are going to be making those commitments. With that, I'd like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Carlos Alvaro Quesada, the President of the Republic of Costa Rica, to deliver a statement. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, friends. First of all, I want to, on behalf of Costa Rica, commit what we are aiming as part of the High Ambition Coalition in Protect of the Environment. We're going to expand the area of protection of the ocean. And what does that have to do with jobs and safety nets? Well, in order to have jobs and safety nets, we have to have a planet first. We have to learn that this is all linked together and it's not silos in which we think about the future, but it's all one reality. I also want to address the topic of finance for development, particularly for the emerging economies and the developing world. We are facing not only the task of financing COVID and COVID recovery, adaptation for the impacts of climate change, hurricanes, flooding, and others. We have also the challenge to comply with the SDGs for the 17 objectives of development. And at the same time, we have, before COVID already, very limited fiscal margins to do that. That means that it's difficult to address them all if there is not a global change regarding financement for development. If there's not a change, we're not going to address any of them completely. And that's a reality. And that means the world is not going to change, and we're going to have a very difficult future ahead of us. Costa Rica has put forward the initiative of FACE, that's the Fund to Alleviate COVID Economics, to create special loans, long-term fixed interest rate in order to finance the recovery. But I do believe, and I say this with all respect, that as a global community, we are procrastinating around this topic. We've been discussing this topic of the finance of development over and over, and we yet do not have an answer. And I'm sorry to say this because somehow I feel I'm preaching to the choir. I think everybody here is convinced that we need that. But therefore, we need groups like the G20 or the G7 to take concrete action, and also the financial institutions to develop the concrete plumbing of these financement mechanisms. And the clock is ticking. So I do believe it's time for G20, G7 to deliver economic support for finance on COVID recovery, climate change, SDGs, and provide fiscal margin to the developing world, and financial institutions to provide concrete plumbing for these mechanisms. Special drawing rights, it's good, but it's not helping yet the developing world. And also, risk rating agencies are working as if COVID did not exist, as if climate change did not exist. We need change to happen, and we need it now. So I believe the best way to do that is to raise the voice in terms of the developed world. Thank you.
We need change, and we need it now. I thank the President of the Republic of Costa Rica for his remarks. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite His Excellency Mr. Guillermo Lasso Mendoza, the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, to deliver a statement. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Director General of the International Labour Organization, ladies and gentlemen, to reactivate production and ensure that we recover from the effects of COVID-19, my government is keen to promote employment and production. For this reason, we tabled in Ecuador's National Assembly a new law on job opportunities that will facilitate the hiring of 70% of Ecuadorians of working age that are jobless. while respecting the rights of those that do have jobs, while creating also equal conditions for women and making thousands of young people more employable, and to ensure also that more people can emerge from the informal employment sector. I must reiterate the global call for action to recover from a crisis caused by COVID-19, one that is people-centered, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. That call was adopted at the 109th International Labour Conference. Following that conference, we have vaccinated more than 9 million persons, saving the lives of Ecuadorians, reactivating the economy and ensuring a gradual return to the workplace. For my government, it is vital that we promote an economy that is open to the world, one that is fiscally responsible if we are to achieve sustainable job-creating growth with decent jobs and creating opportunities for everyone, thus placing people at the center of the development and contributing to the global objective of ending poverty and minimizing the negative impacts of the pandemic. Climate and environmental action can afford new job opportunities as we advance towards a green economy. My government, with the support of multilateral organizations, has been developing strategies to create jobs as part of our pathways toward decarbonization and building resilience to climate change. In conclusion, nothing is more stressful than not having employment. This stress must be combated by creating jobs, good quality jobs, and creating with a vision of the future mechanisms that enable employers and especially SMEs to have appropriate tools and facilities to hire the people that they need to reactivate production, create jobs, and advance in their efforts to eradicate poverty. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Ryder, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Accelerator, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Ryder, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Accelerator, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Ryder, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Accelerator, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Ryder, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, Mr. Accelerator, for his speech. And I would like to thank the Constitutional President